Yeah, a very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our discussion today. Cold War 2.0, that's the topic we want to talk about. Of course, the Cold War ended in December 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but just 30 years later, Russia's war in Ukraine changed everything. So what is the situation now? Russia taking a stand against the West, an open stand, and are we now in a new era in Cold War 2.0, or is this just going on? Did the first Cold War never stop? That's the question we want to discuss today, and also how can we avoid conflict, such horrific conflicts which we are experiencing at the moment in Ukraine, how we can avoid it in the future. And with me, I have a distinguished panel here. So first of all, we have Ian Bremmer. He's the president of the Eurasia Group, the political risk consultancy, and it's based in New York. Then we have Michael McCall. He's a Republican congressman for Texas, 10th District, and ranking member of the House of Foreign Affairs Committee. And to my left, we have Ivana Klimpush-Tinsadze. I hope I spelled it correctly, pronounced it correctly. She's a member of the Ukrainian Parliament for the European Solidarity Party and chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Ukraine's integration into the European Union. And last but not least, Kishore Mahbubani. He's a distinguished fellow of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore and a former diplomat. Welcome to all of you. And ladies and gentlemen, you will have the chance to join the discussion later and raise questions if you have any. And I'd like to start with you, Ivana. You just came directly from Kiev to yesterday, I think, or the day before yesterday, to Davos. How's the situation in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, thank you for having this discussion, and thank you for including Ukraine and Ukrainian voice in this discussion. I think it's very important. Obviously, at this particular moment, there is still no safe place in Ukraine. And Russia makes sure that nobody in any area, where in that area which is occupied by Russian Federation, or where the fearful fighting is continuing, or where people still live under non-occupation, that people would feel comfortable and not fearing about their lives. So that puts a serious pressure on us. And I wanted to start from something that we have just talked with colleagues. You know, everybody was giving us, Ukraine, also in Russia and in the West, was giving us from 48 to 72 hours to hold. And 3 months later, here we are talking about Ukraine holding the stance, irrespectively of that disastrous, barbaric, absolutely bloody war that Russia is conducting across the country, with all the tortures, with all the killings, with all the rapings, with all the pain that we see across the country. We are holding the ground. But definitely, it's not only about the heroism of our armed forces and the unity of our society. It is because there was something that was totally also, I think, underestimated by the aggressor, that there will be a free world coming behind Ukraine, and pretty promptly. And that is something very different from how the situation was developing back in 2008 when Russia attacked Georgia, or in 2014 when let's be honest, pitiful sanctions have been introduced for the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. And right now, how the world came together and what are the instruments being enrolled in response to this attack. This is something that allows us to have instruments to fight back. We still need more heavy weaponry. We still need more sanctions on Russian Federation. We still need more of the backing and much wider also community of states to stand together with Ukraine. But definitely, I think we all understand that today we are fighting. The war is ongoing between world and anti-world, between the humanity and inhumanity. And I think that that's something that has to be understood. It is about world of rule-based order against those who do not want to respect it and want to discredit all the international organizations and all the possibilities we had to ensure security regionally or globally.
Thank you, Ivana. Ian, I'd like to come to you now. Russia has fought worse than many predicted and has also suffered significant losses. Is Russia, from your point of view, still a global power, or has it lost its status now?
I'm sorry.
Do you want to go? You could
I
just...
know. I thought. I
Yeah,
didn't know you
Michael,
said something.
please. Also,
Would you like me?
please, yeah.
I think we completely underestimated the will of the Ukraine people and way overestimated the strength of the Russian military. It's almost their tactics are almost World War II style, whereas ours are very high tech. We're pushing those high tech weapons in as I speak, like the Switchblade 600 that is a lethal drone with a tremendous payload. It's anti-armor, and that's helping. I wish we'd done that before the invasion, not after, but better late than never. But I think our military has been astounded at how incompetent they seem to have been. They've lost a third of their forces. This is like a David versus Goliath type conflict. And it seems to me we have to do everything we can to help Ukraine. And I think the tide has turned. I think Putin's goal was to divide and conquer NATO, and NATO has come out stronger than ever. Finland and Sweden will become now new nations in NATO, and the entire world has, with the sanctions, which could be stronger, but has come out against Putin. I think he totally miscalculated this.
But Michael, it sounds as if we are in the Cold War still, as if it never stopped.
It's cold, but it's also on the verge of being a hot war. And what I mean by that, he's brought the butcher of Syria to conduct this war now, who dropped chemical weapons on Syrians and civilians with Assad. And I think what we're most concerned about is if the butcher of Syria goes to his ways and drops chemical weapons in theater and or a short-range tactical nuke. They do have very sophisticated nuclear weapons, and that would be a moment of desperation, kind of like a scorpion being backed into a corner. We obviously don't want that to happen, but I think the question, we have to talk about this and think about what happens if Putin gets desperate enough to do this. How would the world and how would NATO respond to this?
Thank you. Ian, what's your take on it?
I agree with Mike more than I want to. I'll tell you that. Look, the Russians were an economic superpower before the Soviet collapse. They're obviously not now. They were an energy superpower. They can still sell to a lot of countries around the world, but their ability to deal with a world that's transitioning to renewables is zero. They've already lost 300,000 of their most talented workers over the course of the last few months, and the intellectual brain drain from Russia was bad after 1991. They were the second largest military exporter in the world, and I see a lot of countries that aren't going to buy that anymore because of how it's performing and also because they won't be able to produce them or the spare parts. I see they're taking apart Aeroflot planes right now for spare parts for the other planes that they're still trying to fly. What they have is 6,000 nuclear warheads. But they also have a leader that's in charge of the country who's not going anywhere. And I absolutely don't believe that we are heading for a stable equilibrium. This is a new Cold War. I agree. And I think it is closer to a new hot war than I would like. I would say that it's a new Cold War in a couple of ways. First of all, the old Cold War, the Iron Curtain divided Europe. The new Cold War, the Iron Curtain unites Europe. Don't underestimate the importance of that. But also the fact that this new Cold War is not global at all. This new Cold War is between Russia and the United States and its advanced industrial allies, and that's it. And nobody else wants a part of it. And so there is a forcible decoupling. Their assets have been frozen. Russia's in a lot of trouble. But when we say that Russia's a pariah, it's a pariah for NATO and for some allies in Asia. But it's not a pariah for India. It's not a pariah for China. It's not a pariah for Brazil. And those things are important too. So it's a much more complicated situation. Final thing I'd say, we talk about nearing a hot war. I remember when Biden met with Putin last June in Switzerland. And Biden set the agenda. Top issue of the agenda, cyber attacks, because the Colonial Pipeline hit. Yeah. And they said, don't you do that. You start hitting critical infrastructure, we're going to hit back. They actually reduced or stopped those attacks for a period of time. Are they going to keep reducing or stopping those attacks? I don't think so. Espionage, disinformation, in terms of, against policymakers, if they have that information, in terms of against elections. I think the ability of the Russians to end in a greater stance of confrontation with the countries that are driving them into the abyss, deservedly so, is a real risk. And I think Mike and I agree pretty fundamentally on that.
Mm-hmm. Kishore, let's talk about China. China is watching the situation in Ukraine with great interest, obviously. So what's your take on China's position with regards to the situation?
Well, let me begin by saying that all of us in this room admire the courage and tenacity of the Ukrainian people. They've done a remarkable job of defending their country, and I think, as you know, the world is on your side in many ways. But at the end of the day, it's not the Ukraine issue that will decide the course of the 21st century. As we all know in this room, the real contest in this century will be between the world's number one power, United States, and the world's number one emerging power, China. And the big question there is, will this US-China contest become Cold War 2.0? And I want to argue that if you actually use Cold War 2.0, you completely misunderstand the nature of the contest between the United States and China, because it is different in at least 5 significant areas. Okay, very quickly. Number one, Cold War I was a competition between free markets and centrally planned state economy. Cold War 2.0 is between free markets in the United States, free markets in China. Number two, in Cold War I, the United States traded more with the world, much more with the world, than the Soviet Union did. Cold War II, China trades more with the rest of the world than the United States does. And number three, the Soviet Union saw the contest primarily as a military contest. As you know, built up a formidable military capability. That's why we have 6,000 nuclear weapons. China doesn't think it's a military contest. It still only has 250 nuclear weapons. It may increase a bit. So it sees it as an economic competition. The Soviet Union had no prospect of ever overtaking the United States to become the number one economy in the world. China can, and probably will have the number one economy in the world. Fourthly, the Soviet Union had a kind of global agenda to compete with the United States everywhere, supporting client states here, client states there. China has no interest in client states. It's interested in trading with the world, creating economic connections, even the Belt and Road Initiative, but it doesn't want to engage in the same kind of competition that US and Soviet Union did. And fifthly, you had at the heart of it all an ideological contest where the Soviet Union was saying, my communism is better than your democratic system. Khrushchev said, I will bury you. China doesn't see this as an ideological contest. And frankly, when future historians write about this contest, they will see it as a contest between a 250-year young republic of the United States and a 4,000-year civilization. And from the Asian point of view, what they see with the return of China is the natural return of a civilization that has been strong for 4,000 years. But I want to conclude by saying that the United States can still win this contest against China. And it can win it not by trying to retain its number one status as the world's number one economy, because China, that's an area where China can overtake the United States. but United States can remain the most admired society on planet Earth. And as you know, we all send our children to study in American universities, not in Chinese universities. We still look up to the United States. And as George Kennan, the famous strategist, once advised, in fact, in Cold War I, he said the way the United States will ultimately win the contest against the Soviet Union is by demonstrating that its domestic society is superior to Soviet domestic society, and it did. So the United States can still remain the world's most admired society. China can have the world's biggest GNP, and I hope at the end of the day, they will have to live with a win-win formula that the rest of the world would appreciate also.
Okay, I will come back to Ivana in a second. I first want to ask Michael, because I know he's very critical about China. Michael, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I guess particular is a nice... I actually agree with everything you said. This is a, in the short term, we're worried about Russia and Ukraine. It's more of a military. Long term, the competition between the great world powers will be between the United States and China. There's no question, about it. And I would say, it's a military and economic competition, but they're very good, and they're a worthy adversary. And we have to learn to compete better, I think. I would say we're in a Cold War with them, but I would say we've been in a Cold War with China for quite some time. And I would take you back to 1997. I was a young federal prosecutor at Maine Justice and prosecuted the Johnny Chung case that then took us to the director of Chinese intelligence and China Aerospace, putting money into his Hong Kong bank account to then influence the presidential election. And why? Because they wanted dual-use technology. They wanted satellite technology, they wanted aerospace technology, and they wanted to get into the WTO. They were successful at all of this. And I would say they've come a long way since 1997, and they're very sophisticated. In fact, even back then, though, my FBI agent got indicted for espionage because he was sleeping with a Chinese spy. You can't make this stuff up. He was compromised. And for 20 years, this FBI asset, Katrina Leung, was reporting back to Beijing. They're very clever and somewhat deceptive, and I agree with you. When we look at Taiwan, which is 90% of the world's advanced semiconductor manufacturing capability, she wants that. And just like Putin, it wasn't a question of if, but when to invade Ukraine. I think she is looking at Taiwan. It's a question of when. If he sees weakness, I think personally, though, he has President Tsai will be up in 2 years. She can't run again for Taiwan presidency. That they're very they're really good at taking over economically and winning elections. So I think she, if I'm predicting, his goal would be to try to do it without a shot fired, just like Hong Kong. Just like the Solomon Islands that my father's generation liberated in World War II, they basically bought Solomon Islands, and they signed a security agreement with them. Mm-hmm. And so the whole South China Sea, but Taiwan is the first shoe to drop, and we have to be very intensely focused. I just got asked on CNN, the president said something like, he sort of violated the one China policy and there used to be strategic ambiguity by saying, we will militarily intervene. Well, I guess that's deterrence. And I think deterrence is the key here, that President Xi, as he looks at what's happening in Ukraine, is it worth it? And we have to persuade him that it's not. But I don't know how many Americans would want to go to war over a tiny island they know nothing about. We had to educate them on Ukraine. Why is Ukraine so important?
Okay, so the U.S. is in a Cold War with China. That's what you're saying.
And we have been for decades.
And it never stopped. That's how I understood it. Ivana, you want to talk about Russia again, I'm sure, and about the Cold War.
And I want to
What's your take?
respond also, because maybe we also have some vision on whether this is Cold War 2.0 and whether it has ever ended. And I think there is a big discussion on who is it among, because you are insisting that this is between the US and China, and I still do not totally agree with the fact that you are putting Russia off this equilibrium. Because, yes, maybe China right now is a more kind of senior partner in this tandem between China and Russian Federation, but at the same time, Russia is right now that most evil driving force of using the hot war instruments in order to get the goals of the Cold War. And here I think that the result of the Russian war against not Ukraine, because Putin is clearly stating that he has announced the war against the West. Yes, with the first aim to erase us from the map of the world as a nation, as a state, because in his historical sick mythology that he has in his mind, we never existed, and we don't exist. And I'm here, the living proof that we do. But we have to understand that they are trying, that everybody like China is watching very attentively with regard to Taiwan, whether the whole world, free world, will allow Putin to succeed, Russia to succeed. Yeah. And that will actually define the next developments within the Cold War, if it's between supposedly US and China, to whether it goes to also to some of the hot stages. And it seems to me that many analysts are talking about that we are kind of re-entering right now to the great powers notion. And we know that that particular notion has led to the First and Second World Wars. So we as Ukrainians, we totally disagree with this notion of great powers, because we understand how dangerous it might be, and how dangerous it might be to suppose that someone has the right to have the influence on this or that part of the world, and so on. And I think that here we have to also think about, yes, all the possibilities of being capable to compete, that's on one side, but, but on the other side of being not afraid. You know, back in earlier Cold War, you know, there were hot wars fought in Asia, in Vietnam, in South Korea, and so on. But it seemed that at that point, somehow, and those were, again, between the major powers, that wasn't about being afraid of nukes and not being afraid. With all the tension, it was there. So I think right now, when we are talking about Russia being this big one of the powers that is right now fighting this with hot instruments, fighting the Cold War, we have to also understand and put additional intellectual capacity into two things: how to actually cut off or break the tandem between China and Russia as its resource base. And I think that that is going to help also with regard to winning in the Cold War 2.0. That's one thing. And another thing is to think, how do you deal potentially with the country that might be even dissolving after the end of this war? Yes, it might sound totally out of touch of reality, because we talked about this with Manuel, and he was like, is this wishful thinking? And I'll tell you no, because let me just remind you one story. 2 weeks before Ukraine has announced independence 31 years ago, there was George Bush Sr., who came to Ukraine saying to Ukrainians, don't you dare to think about independence. Don't even try to imagine. You don't have the possibility. And that was because there was underestimation of what is ongoing within the Soviet Union at that point, and because there was such a big fear how to deal with country that is dissolving, and when you have nuclear weapons on different parts of this country. So that's why I'm encouraging right now to put intellectual, maybe intelligence, maybe some other, analytical powers and type of thinking in terms of foreseeing what kind of Russia we will have to deal with, and how to cut that connection between Russia and China, right, in order to ensure that we have the rule-based order and we'll have the security in the whole world in the future.
Okay, I think, Kishore, you want to add something.
Yeah, no, as I said, we admire your courage, but at the same time, as you know, geopolitics has been around for 2,000, 3,000 years. It's a cold and brutal business, you know. And the more emotional you get about it, the less you see clearly what are the hard geopolitical realities.
Well, it's understandable. The emotions
and
are
at the end of the
understandable,
day,
of course.
Russia is not going to be a major player, right? Let's be very, very clear. Its economy, I don't know what the size is again. What is it? Compared
It
to,
was 11th.
yeah, I mean, it's just tiny
Not
compared
11th
to,
anymore.
it's no longer in the first league, okay? So, of the world economies. So it doesn't have the capacity, apart from nuclear weapons, to become a superpower again. It is basically yesterday's power. Tomorrow's power will be China. That's why I'm saying, you agree with me,
Yeah.
the real contest will be with China. And I want to emphasize also that when it comes to geopolitics, it's important to be clinical. And China has clearly lost out with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in at least four ways. Number one, what Xi Jinping wanted in 2022 was a stable and calm atmosphere so that he can arrange his third term. Instead, he's dealing with a massive domestic crisis, and trying to deal with zero COVID is a real nightmare in China, and then a massive global crisis. That's the last thing he wanted. It doesn't help Xi Jinping at all. Number two, his number one strategic partner in the world, it's Russia, no question. And his number one strategic partner, Russia, has been weakened dramatically. Right? Russian forces have done so badly, amazingly badly in Ukraine, right? And number three, Xi Jinping wanted to deal with United States and Europe as two separate independent poles of power. Ukraine has, boom, brought United States and Europe together. Yep. Now China has to deal with the United West. That's a minus for China. Fourthly, the Chinese have $3.2 trillion in reserves, which you thought, wow, that's a lot of money. That's cash. I got cash in the bank. I'm very strong. After the United States took over half the central bank reserves of Russia, all these assets have become liabilities. They can evaporate very fast. So if you look at it in terms of the geostrategic equation, China has been damaged by the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yep.
But at the same time, I can also tell you that when you deal with the Chinese, 1 year is irrelevant. A decade is the minimum unit of time you deal with, and better even a century. And in the case of Taiwan, if you want to understand Chinese attitudes towards Taiwan, understand the century of humiliation from the Opium War of 1842 to the end of World War II in 1945. Remember how Taiwan was lost? It was lost when China lost the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. Now, Taiwan to them is the last living symbol of the century of humiliation. So it's not about President Xi. There's 100% rock-solid consensus in the Chinese body politic that at some point in time, Taiwan must come back and reunify with China.
From a Chinese point of view.
Yeah, from the Chinese point of view. But that doesn't mean, by the way, that reunification doesn't have to happen in 1-2 years. Remember, a decade, 2 decades is nothing for them. And number two, you can have all kinds of wonderful diplomatic fudges whereby you bring Taiwan back nominally in the Chinese family, but it remains effectively as an autonomous unit. It can be done. So if you want to be creative in solving problems like this, you have to understand the Chinese psyche and then understand what you try to do to avoid making sure that you don't have a Ukraine-type war in Taiwan.
I want to come back to you, Ian, now. Ian, do you see the danger of a tandem between China and Russia, like what Ivana was saying?
I think that when Xi Jinping stood up on the stage with Putin and said on February 4th that this was a global friendship without limits, they expected some very different outcomes from what was going to come from Russia and Ukraine. It was a big deal for Putin. It's not as big of a deal for China. The worldviews of these two men are aligned. because the Chinese do believe that the Americans and allies are trying to contain them in Asia. And they see that as analogous to the way that the United States is trying to contain Russia in Europe. But Russia's economy is 1/10 of China's. And when the Chinese president talks to the German chancellor and the French president, it is very clear the Chinese do not want to be tarred with the same brush that Putin has been tarred with. And so, yes, it's a friendship without limits, but it's also a friendship without that many benefits, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when Jake Sullivan spent 7 hours in Rome talking to the Chinese, and he leaked first to the Financial Times, right, that we're really angry about the military support that the Chinese are saying they're going to give to the Russians, and they better not engage in breaking our sanctions. The Chinese are not providing that military support now, and they're not breaking the sanctions because they may be angry with the U.S., but they also are pretty sensible about where their interests are. So I don't think that in 5 years' time we're going to see the emergence of this Russia-China alliance that is the basis of a Cold War 2.0. I think Russia has a big problem. I think Russia is increasingly not in any way a great power. And I think that is a problem because, as Mike said, Russia is getting backed into a corner for largely their own fault, though there are certainly things you can blame the West on and missed opportunities, and frankly, they should have been hit a lot harder in 2008 and 2014. There are a lot of reasons the Russians now believe that they were going to get away with what they got away with. I mean, I truly believe that if Putin had any inclination that what was coming was actually coming, he wouldn't have gone into Kiev with those troops on February 24th. I mean, there were too few troops to take Kiev. I mean, he thought the Ukrainians weren't going to fight. He was wrong about that, too. So, I mean, incredible misjudgment. But the one place that I disagree with Kishore, and by the way, Mike, you said you agreed with everything Kishore said. You surely don't agree with Kishore that China is a free market economy. Yeah. If you do agree with that, I'm very surprised. We'll get that on the record. We'll get that on the record. But the thing I disagree. Okay, we're good on that.
We're on the same page on that.
No, I know. I'm just giving you a hard time. I'm allowed to do that. So, but the place that I disagree with Mike is that I don't believe that we are in a Cold War with China. And the reason I say that is because of the extraordinary interdependence that persists between the American and the Chinese economies. Now, I think that there are a lot of people in the United States that are deeply unsettled by that. And I think there are good reasons to be unsettled because there's no trust between the two countries. But I think that that interdependence will persist. And, I mean, the private sector, with no question. But not only that, the average American who just wants to buy those goods. The Chinese tourists who want to travel to the U.S. They want to send their kids to American universities. I think that that will persist. In fact, if you made me make a bet with you, I would say in 10 years' time there'll be more of it rather than less, even though there'll be aspects of Cold War on data and areas that are core to national security. And so in that regard, I think the real geopolitical challenge here is the fact that the Russians have just forcibly decoupled themselves from the G20. The first time in history that's ever happened. And I don't know where they're going to go. Because for me, any scenario I look at does not feel like a stable and sustainable equilibrium for Putin. And I don't think Putin's going anywhere in Moscow, so I don't know what he's going to do. That's what I think we need to manage.
Okay, Michael.
It's amazing how much we are in agreement. I was told we were going to disagree vehemently, but I think we're in a large part in agreement. And you're right, China, it's not a free market. They're investing $1 trillion in their digital economy. It was on the front page of the China Daily today, right? I would say maybe it's not a Cold War, it's a great competition. And America needs to wake up to the competition. And if we're not competing with, say, Belt and Road in Indo-Pacific, Africa, and Latin America, if we're not even on the field playing, how do you win, right? Just like in a sports analogy. Nixon went to China as a counter to Russia. Back then, Russia was truly a superpower and more of an economic superpower than China was. That is completely reversed. China now is the economic superpower of the day. And I would just argue that even going back to that case I prosecuted, that technology is going to be the great battlefield. And it's going to be more of an economic type battlefield. If I told you that not only did we give them technology, but they have stolen so much intellectual property in the trillions of dollars from the United States, but that we are, in fact, selling them today the technology, for instance, that they used to build their hypersonic weapon, their missile, that orbited the entire planet and landed with precision that could carry nuclear payload. Why is the United States, why are we doing this? And I would argue that we are intertwined with China. Unlike Russia, which is easy to sanction, we are so economically intertwined with China, it'd be very difficult. And when they have the central bank digital currency that can evade SWIFT, it makes it even more difficult. But I would argue that where we need to wake up after COVID are the critical supply chains. America needs to wake up and start manufacturing more of this, either in the United States or with our allies. And that's 3 areas. That would be medical. We saw that after COVID. 2 would be rare earth minerals. China controls 85% of the global market. And by the way, they produce their solar panels and batteries in the Xinjiang province where they commit genocide. And then lastly, a bill I introduced, the Chips for America Act, semiconductor chips. I mean, we're having a hard time buying vehicles, our most advanced weapon systems, the ones we're trying to send to Ukraine. Do you know we have a backlog because we don't have the chips? And when Taiwan controls 90% of that, that's the competition. And
Michael, time is running out.
We can't decouple everything,
I
right?
want to ask Ivana also, because we are talking, and Kishore, you will have a chance as well. We talk about Russia, we talk about Ukraine, we talk about China. What is Europe's position? What do you expect from Europe in all that what we heard here today?
That's a very good question, but let me just a couple of things of reaction. You were saying that Russia won't be a major player because of its weak economy and so on. You are again underestimating the whole history of Russia is about conquering wars, and irrespectively of whether it has the capacity to do that or not. I was born still in the Soviet Union. I do remember how we were taught to be deprived of everything because we needed the great superpower, and they're continuing on that logic. So it doesn't matter how much they have for the ability to fight, but they will give up on everything. They will disregard any human being. They don't give a damn about every single person in order to regain territories and in order to project power, even if they don't have it, and in order to kind of be great in their minds. And I think that that still gets us to the point that Russia, we don't have to repeat the mistake that was done after the end of the Soviet of the Cold War I, when Russia was allowed to actually raise again. I think that right now, Russia, after this war with the Ukraine, or with Russian war with Ukraine, we would have to ensure that Russia doesn't have any tiniest any tiniest capacity to actually yet again start another war anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And that means much stronger sanctions and yes, not getting to the technologies and so on, what you were talking about with regard to China. And one more thing, as far as I recall, US was cooperating with Mao against Soviet Union, mm-hmm. And I think so that Xi Jinping is almost a Washington D.C. Democrat in comparison to Mao. So there is a possibility.
Not a Republican.
Well, no, I'm just kidding. Obviously, I am kidding. You understand
okay.
what I mean, right? But that's more about competition, about maybe rules and some procedures, as opposed to what Russia is trying to do. So I don't want you to actually get Russia off the equation. And with regard to Europe, in many things, there are really tectonic changes in the policy of European countries. We see that happening. Still too late, but it's better later than never, that's for sure. And we still have to push them to catch up with what the US and what UK are capable of doing in order to actually have this unity, but be kind of on equal footing with with the whole West, and
how
not
do you
only
push
speak.
them?
How do you push them? Okay, well. first, we need to ensure that they stop pushing Ukraine, some of the nations in Europe, stop pushing Ukraine for making a ceasefire and a peace deal with Russian Federation at the expense of Ukraine. Because that's not something that is going to happen. And I think that from there, when we push them, I think it's about really values, whether their values are declared or they are ready to stand up for them, and whether they are ready to defend them. And if they do, that means standing up to the challenge and actually giving also this heavy weaponry to Ukraine, and actually getting rid of buying energy sources from the Russian Federation, and so on and so on and so on.
So Europe is part of this Cold War. Kishore wants to add something. Ladies and gentlemen, it's unfortunately already very late. I think I can take one or two questions, but first, Kishore, if you could
Just,
be
yeah,
brief,
very
please.
quickly. I just want to respond to Michael's point when he said that you could wake up America to this contest with China. Actually, in many ways, when I go to the United States, I find America has woken up to the contest with China. There's a very strong anti-China consensus. You can see that across the Washington, D.C. establishment. But as I document in a book I wrote called Has China Won? What the United States has is an attitude towards China, but it doesn't have a long-term strategy.
Right.
And what I argue in my book is that what the United States should do is work out a comprehensive long-term strategy for managing this return of China. China, by contrast, does have a comprehensive long-term strategy. And just to give you a simple example, in Cold War I, it was the United States that traded with the rest of the world. Now China, China trades far more with the rest of the world. And 10 years from now, the gap will be enormous. And if you stop signing free trade agreements with the rest of the world, you're giving China an advantage.
Okay, let's take
TPP,
somebody.
China came in, right?
Yeah.
Let's give our
Agree with
audience a
that.
chance to ask a question as well. Please, the gentleman here in front.
Thanks, Seth Moulton, a Democratic colleague of Mr. McCall on the House Armed Services Committee. Just a couple of quick points, and I'd love to hear your response, particularly you, Ian, on this. Look, I think this is an ideological battle. It's just not over an economic system. It's over whether we support democracy or autocracy. And that's the one thing that brings Russia and China together. And so they might not be likely allies, but just like us and Russia, during World War II, they're aligned on that point, and they see us and our Western allies and our technology and everything else as a common enemy. And if you think it's not a military competition, I just think you're not looking closely at what China is actually doing to build its military. So I think there's a danger in just talking about this as Cold War 2.0, because it makes it sound like we can use the same strategies to win that we used to win the old Cold War. When this is actually somewhere between a Cold War and a hot war. I like to call it a warm war, though some people say that sounds good, Seth. You shouldn't use a positive term. I think it's a very heated economic and military competition. China and Russia are not natural allies, but they are aligned with a common enemy, and it's about autocracy versus democracy. And the chances for miscalculation, the chances for this to blow up in our faces are higher because it is closer to a hot war than a Cold War. So I'd just love to hear your response to that.
So this was more a statement. I take one more, and then we.
It
have the
actually
last
is not, because it quite disagrees with what
Okay,
Ian and Mike
Ian,
were saying in some respects.
If you like to answer.
No,
and
I
then
think
take
it's
one more.
I agree with one piece of it, not the other. I agree, and it's a great formulation of a debate. I agree strongly that it has aspects of a hot war. It is not a Cold War. It is absolutely heated and has the potential to morph into one very dangerous. I think Mike and I agree on that too. On the ideological front, though, two reasons I disagree. One is that the Chinese are very happy to engage with equally and politically align with both democracies and autocracies as long as there is very strong economic business to be done. They are indifferent to the local political system in a way that the United States says that we're not. In principle, we are, but we often don't follow through on it. Second reason I think it should not become an ideological battle is because in all, and I hate saying this because this bothers me, is that in all of the areas that the United States has very strong capabilities, the dollar is the global reserve currency, every bit as strong as it was 10, 20 years ago. You could argue stronger. the role of the U.S. as an energy superpower, a food superpower, our universities that Kishore loves, all of this stuff. I think the one area that we are weakest in terms of leading by example and exporting is our political system, our representative democracy. So if I'm advising Biden, I don't want him leading with our weakest Trump card, if you don't mind me saying that. And that wasn't true in 1989. We beat the Soviets because the ideological war was clearly in our favor. If we got into an ideological war with China that believes our political system is in structural decline, it's not. I actually think that undermines us. But it's a good debate.
Just one sentence. Can I add one sentence? The three largest democracies in the world is number 1, India. Number 2 is the United States. Number 3, Indonesia. Of these 3 largest democracies in the world, one sees it as an ideological contest. India and Indonesia do not see it as an ideological contest.
Can I?
Okay.
I agree completely.
So I agree it's both military and economic, but I do think China, unlike the brute force of Russia, which is all military might, they can outsmart us from an economic warfare using trade and their economic engine as a weapon against the United States. And why do I say it? Because why did India abstain, right? Well, it gets Russian equipment, but how did they take the Solomon Islands? Security agreement. They bought them off. Hong Kong without a shot fired. Why did 20 nations in Africa abstain from the UN Security Council resolution? Because China has bought them off through Belt and Road. They are competing on the field in Indo-Pacific, in Africa, in Latin America, and the United States is not on that field. We don't have a long-term strategy. They do, sir, and it's a 100-year marathon.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to come to an end to the debate now. It was very interesting, and obviously we could have gone for hours. And just my takeaway is we are in a hot war, and the situation is much more complicated than it was in the past. And the main contenders are the US and China.
Right.
And don't forget Europe, but what kind of role Europe has, we don't know yet.
Can I throw a provocative question for the Ukrainian? So if, let's say we got Hitler to the negotiating table after he invaded all of Europe and Russia, would we negotiate with him? Would we say, okay, you can take Czechoslovakia, Poland? I mean, where do you think, now that the war crimes have happened and my bill passed the House, I know Zelensky says I will sit down and negotiate, but is that time over?
I think that time is definitely over. And I think that after what the whole world have seen in Bucha, in Irpin, in Borodyanka, actually the very same things are being revealed right now also in those liberated areas in Kharkiv region. The atrocities that we are dealing with are absolutely insane. So the war crimes, crimes against humanity, acts of genocide, all of this together, I think precludes any room for compromise between us and those who want to live and those who came to just kill us. So there is no really negotiation maneuver in there, and I think that that has to be very well understood, and that's why we're saying, and I think that that's already across the political board in Ukraine, irrespectively of which political party you represent and so on, that in order to survive, it's existentially, we have to win. If we get somewhere in the middle, that means that Russia will have yet another possibility to attack, and it will use that possibility. So that would be just appeasing of aggressive behavior of Russian Federation.
Okay, with that note we end, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience and for that today.
I just thought I'd ask that because